Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I don't know why everyone thinks I'm funny, because I'm really a serious guy, you know. Today I will talk about domain-driven design and Angular, and I want to start with a question. Namely, the question is, what do you think, what does it take for a good architecture? A good sustainable architecture you can maintain in long term? Well, if you ask me, it takes a lot of experience, of course. You need a lot of people, in the best case a diverse group, where everyone can bring in his or her experiences, and a modern architect is just a moderator who tries to combine the existing knowledge. And of course, there are some ways to accelerate this process of architecture making. For instance, you can give them caffeine, or you can feed them with pizza. I've made a lot of good experience with pizza. For instance, with pizza provinciale. You know pizza provinciale? This is the pizza with corn and bacon on it. I can only recommend it. But for the time being, let's stick with experiences. When we think about experiences, one big question is, how can we share experiences we made? And to answer this, some people wrote down best practices, and other people wrote down patterns. And some people took patterns, they took best practices, they added a philosophy, and so they created a methodology. A methodology that tells you how to get from A to B, how to transform your, let's say, requirements into an architecture. And domain-driven design is such a methodology. It shows you what to do to get a good architecture for your current requirements. And this is what the current session is about. Today in this session, I want to show you how to create a sustainable front-end architecture by using ideas from domain-driven design. Regarding the contents, I will show you two things. First of all, I will show you what domain-driven design is about, which is just a roundup. It is just a quite short overview, and here I will focus on one aspect, namely on strategic design. And then I will show you how to implement those ideas of strategic domain design together with Angular and an NX monorepository. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Manfred, I'm a trainer and consultant for Angular. I'm helping companies around the world with Angular and Angular architecture. I'm part of the Google Developer Expert team, and since the beginning of the year, I'm also a part of the Angular team. I'm helping them to implement some features with the CLI. My current product is also about Angular. It's a 3-day workshop regarding Angular in the enterprise. Consists of a lot of advanced topics. Okay, let's get started with domain-driven design in a nutshell. So from a high-level perspective, if you look at domain-driven design, you can see two disciplines. The first discipline is strategic design, which is about decomposing a big system into tiny parts. Tiny parts that can be hopefully easily maintained, tiny parts that hopefully don't need to know much about each other. If you put it into another way, you could say, this is about architecture. This is about decreasing the complexity of your overall system. The second part is tactical design, which is more about design patterns and practices, and so it is more about software design. Because of this, here I will stick with strategic design. By the way, a little story. The original author of domain-driven design said, if he would redo his original book, he would put strategic design into the first chapters. Because what happened was he put it into the last chapters, and so it was somehow overseen by some people. Most people focused on tactical design, but he thinks that strategic design is the more important one, and so it would be beneficial, he says, to put it into the first chapters the next time. If you are asking me what strategic design is doing, I would say strategic design is preventing this very situation here. It is preventing that you get a system where everything is intermingled with everything else. I think you know those kind of systems where you try to modify something here and you break something there. This is not easy to get maintained, of course. If I may show you an example, you could, of course, write a big e-procurement system. But instead of this big e-procurement system, you could just slice it down into tiny subdomains, for instance, into a catalog domain, into an approval domain, into an ordering domain, and into a specification domain. That would be totally possible, and so you are ending up with tinier sub-projects that are more easy to maintain. Those sub-projects are called subdomains in the area of domain-driven design. And there is a lot of theory behind this, how to find the right subdomains, how to slice your big application into tiny, more or less self-contained parts that don't need to know much about each other. Okay, let's stick with this approach. Now let's talk about the second thing I want to show you, namely about NX monorepositories and about how we can implement those subdomains with NX monorepositories. First of all, what is a monorepo? Well, to put it in a nutshell, a monorepo is just a project consisting of subprojects. That means all your subprojects are in here within this repository. If you look here, for instance, you have an approval library, a catalog library, and so on and so forth. To get started, I just created one library for each subdomain. We will later create additional libraries for each subdomain. One of the nice things here is that we have this node modules folder. The nice thing is not that we have it, but that we have it just once. Because that means we just have one version of all the dependencies. We just have one version of Angular, one version of Rx, one version of NGRX, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is beneficial. Just imagine you would have Angular 5 here and Angular 7 there. And then you try to compile everything together. I guarantee you all hell would break loose. So in this case, we are really lucky. We don't end up with version conflicts. And we don't have the burden with distributing libraries. We don't have to version our libraries to assign a new version number. We don't have to publish it and make sure everyone else installs the right version. We just check it into source control, and the other parts of the application can use it. So now the question is, how can we squeeze our strategic design with all the subdomains in here into a monorepository? And one answer is just create one folder per each domain. You would create a catalog folder for the catalog domain. You would create an ordering folder for the ordering domain. And then you have a shared folder for all the shared stuff. With terms of domain-driven design, you would call this the shared kernel. The shared kernel that consists of everything you need in several domains. Of course, it's your goal to keep the shared kernel at the minimum because you want to have self-contained domains. You don't want to have lots of dependencies between the shared kernel and the domains because dependencies can lead to breaking changes. So when you have those folders, you can fill those folders with libraries. And here I have 4 categories of libraries. The first category is a feature library. The second category is an UI library. And as you see here, the feature library consists smart components, which are components that know about your use cases. And the UI libraries contain dump components. Components that do not know about your use cases at all. For me, a very good example for a dump component is a dates-time picker. The dates-time picker does not know anything about your use case. It does not even know which kind of date is displayed. But it displays a date. And because of this, it can be reused with all your use cases that are dealing somehow with dates. That means the UI level here is more reusable, of course. Then we have a domain layer. which contains your data models and your domain logic. And you have a utility layer with common utility stuff like authentication or logging, for instance. As you see here, this structure is quite clean, and so it is quite maintainable. You also end up with tiny libraries that are hopefully more maintainable than a big chunk of source code. And one of the smart things here is that you can easily introduce access rules. For instance, you could say that one level here is only allowed to access layers below. So the feature layer could access everything, the domain layer could only access utilities. And one more time, this is to prevent coupling, to prevent this intermingled system where everything depends upon everything else. This is one rule for access restrictions. Another rule would be to restrict the domain access. One domain is only allowed to talk with itself and with the shared part. So in this case, catalog can only talk with catalog and with shared, and ordering can only talk with ordering and, of course, with shared. One more time, this prevents intermingling. Well, sometimes it is not perfect, but sometimes it is necessary that you can talk with other domains. And of course, it is not a good idea to give other domains full access to your domain. Because if they have full access, you know, breaking changes, intermingling. And so the idea here is to just provide an API for other domains. The API is only exporting what other domains are allowed to use. Not everything, just a tiny amount. And this tiny amount needs to be backwards compatible, but not the rest. So here, ordering could access tiny amounts of the catalog. So perhaps you're saying, well, this looks nice, this looks clean, this looks tidied up, but somehow it's overwhelming. So many libraries. Well, to be true, it is not overwhelming at all, because you don't have a full rectangle. In most cases, you only have feature libraries and domain libraries in the real domains, and the rest goes into the shared kernel, because UI and utility functions are functions you want to reuse over domains. Talking about domain logic, what is domain logic? Well, you can subdivide into three things, into three parts. You can isolate it with an application layer and an infrastructure layer. Both of them is a term from DomainDriven Design. The domain layer itself only contains entities and logic, business logic, making sure that your entities, your models are consistent. And then the application layer has facades that provide everything for one use case. That means they orchestrate everything so that you can easily implement one use case by using one facade. And the facade also hides your state management. Perhaps you know this solution or this situation where you don't know if you should go with Redux or not, with NGRX or not. And if you are not sure, you could just start with a facade. And this facade could, to get started, just leverage behavior subjects. And when needed, you can squeeze in NGRX below the facade. The rest of the system would not even notice. This allows you to introduce more complex state management libraries step by step. Yeah, and the infrastructure layer, of course, as the name implies, is accessing your backend. It provides services to get data from the backend. You could put those three aspects into three different libraries. I normally put it into one library because I don't want to have an explosion of libraries. I don't want to have too much libraries. Well, perhaps you're saying, yeah, looks nice, but layers, really, layers are that much 2005 or 1990, something around this. And yes, that might be true. There are some alternatives to layers nowadays, like hexagonal architectures, clean architecture. But for me, this is not about layers. What I want to show you is that it is a good way to slice your application into domains and to create some access restrictions to prevent intermingling. The rest is up to you. Well, if you like this idea, I want to encourage you to look into NX. NX allows you to create such monorepositories with access restrictions, with a lot of other features. And it is just an Angular CLI project. Such an NX project is just an Angular CLI project with some extensions. For me, it is the sugar dip on top of the Angular CLI. So let me use the last time during this session for a simple demonstration about this. What I have here, not here, what I have here is a monorepository with several domains. As you see here, my NX repository has an libs folder, and here we have one subfolder per domain. We have catalog, we have ordering, we have shared. And if we look into catalog, we have several feature libraries, and we have a domain library, and so on and so forth. So it is quite tidy. So, of course, when we go to the command line, and this is the first feature I want to show you from NGRX, you can call a command called depgraph. And this is very nice. It's also manager-proof, because you have a graphic here. You see which library is accessing which other libraries. And this helps you on a visual way to prevent too much intermingling. Now, as in every romantic movie, I'm saying one sentence like, let's do something crazy. I think we know this from every romantic movie. Let's do something crazy. Let's start Edge. I really like Edge because it has one cool feature. We can draw here. So let's take this pencil. If we look here, we have a catalog feature. Can you see this? Yeah. Beautiful projection, a catalog feature. And we have here another catalog feature. Or here we have our domain logic for the catalog, and here we have an API for the catalog, exposing stuff for other domains. If we look there, we have something from the ordering domain. And if we look at the rest, we have something from the shared kernel. And just by looking at the colors, you can tell that you cannot easily access other domains. They are more or less self-contained. If you want to access other domains, you have to go via an API, or you have to go via the shared kernel. So quite clean. Now let's do something crazy. Let's violate our layer rules. Let's drive against the one-way. Here my utility layer is accessing the UI layer, which is against the rules I've outlined before. So let's try it. Shared util off. And here I have this very bad line of code. And as you see here, I immediately get an linting error. The linting error tells me that the utility library is only allowed to access other utility libraries. That means my architecture is enforced. I can also do this at command line. Let me show you. ng lint for the project shared util out. And bang, I will get a slap into the face. I will get this very same error here on the command line. And this is very pretty, because when it works on the command line, you can automate it. You can do it in your CI process, or you can do it as a check-in rule. Perhaps developers are not even allowed to check something in that violates this architectural rules. So let me just show you another thing. If you want to create a new library, just use ng-generate library instead of ng-generate module. So for you, it's the same amount of work. Instead of module, use lib, write down the name of the library, write down the directory like your domain, which could be ordering, and you are good. The rest is done automatically for you by the tool. Awesome. So if you like this talk, perhaps you will like my ebook I wrote down. It's about this stuff and about a bit more. And if you didn't like this talk, well, check out my ebook anyway. Perhaps I'm writing better than I'm speaking, who knows? So let me sum up. We've seen it is beneficial to subdivide a big application into slices, into self-contained domains that do not know much about each other. And it could be also beneficial to slice the domains into layers. It is a nice idea to just use ng-generate library instead of ng-generate module. You get all those features, and it is not more effort for you. If you go with fine-grained libraries, you have a lot of advantages, like access restrictions. You can only define that only the changed libraries are retested or recompiled, and those access restrictions help you to get a more maintainable architecture. And there is one last thing I want you to remember. If you forget everything, please always remember this one last thing, namely, you can accelerate your software architecture process by providing coffee and pizza, and I recommend you pizza provinciale, you know, corn and bacon, very, very important. Please keep this in mind. So here you have all my information, all my contact data. My slides are already available in my blog, and if you want, follow me on Twitter so that we can keep in contact. Thanks for coming. Have a nice day.